Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 50th New York Film Festival and our New York Film Festival Talks, a series of free meetings, intimate meetings with filmmakers in the festival and other industry figures. I want to mention, actually, this is the first of two such events tonight. For those of you who want to stick around at 8 o'clock, we're going to have a free discussion with some of the filmmakers, a Meet the Filmmakers panel from this year's festival. But we're kicking things off tonight with a really a special event. I'm very, very pleased we were able to make this happen. A rare chance to hear from a truly legendary a figure in the American film industry. I think that the word legendary applies here. Tom Rothman's career dates back to the mid-1980s and the very origins of the American independent film scene, working with filmmakers like Jim Jarmusch and Spike Lee. And it goes all the way to the very top of the Hollywood A-list as the co-chairman and CEO of Fox Filmed Entertainment, where he has overseen, among other things, the two most successful films in the world of all time, Titanic and Avatar, the very successful franchises, X-Men, Ice Age, Fantastic Four, but also the founding of Fox Searchlight, the very successful indie division before there were such things at studios, and one that's continued to last as all the others have disappeared pretty much. So before I bring Tom out, I'm going to run a wonderful clip reel that was put together earlier this year, rather, by the Gotham Awards, where you're not supposed to come out yet. Where Tom was duly honored for his extraordinary career, and this pretty much sums up, much better than I can in words, everything that Tom has done and why it's going to be so interesting to talk to him. So take a look at that, and then we'll start our conversation.
Filmmakers Jim Jarmusch and Ang Lee.
You can't go through this.
Thank you. It's really an honor to present this tribute to Tom Rothman, someone who certainly means a lot to me and to all of us. I'm also honored to be here with Ang Lee, someone I greatly respect. Tom Rothman and I go back quite far. Over 25 years ago, he was my lawyer. He was at the firm Frankfurt, Garbus, Klein & Sells, now Frankfurt, Kerner, Klein & Sells. And he was also a producer of my film Down by Law. He put together financing for the film. He organized all of the legal shenanigans and was very innovative in the way that he did put this film together. So I'm always deeply indebted to him for that. But I also, just for our friendship, I'd just like to tell you two little anecdotes. One is that back then, whenever Tom was leaving town to go to the airport to JFK or LaGuardia, he would leave a little early often and stop by my loft on the Bowery, our loft, which was completely empty except for rain buckets and a bed and a table. And we used to play fast-pitch wiffle ball before he went to the airport. And I don't know if any of you play baseball indoors, but it's really, it's a great way to play baseball. And we would pitch very fast. Tom was a really good hitter. He had a nasty slider. And so we used to do that, which I still have great memories of. A few years, though, after Down by Law, Tom called me saying that the eminent British producer David Putnam was passing through New York and for some reason wanted to invite me to lunch. So I told, being a bit shy of like the business side of things, I said to Tom, well, you know, you got to come too. I don't know what to do with this guy. And he said, okay. So we had a really very lovely lunch with David Putnam, who was really a gentleman. He was interested, a little bit interested in my work. But really what happened was I found out a few weeks later he became very interested in Tom Rothman. And he was responsible really for kidnapping him and taking him to Hollywood. So for a while I half-jokingly accused Tom of betraying me and joining the other side. But I often like to bite the hand that doesn't feed me. So in fact I was very happy for Tom and his true destiny, which was, well, history speaks for itself. He has been so supportive to so many films. He's been very innovative in the way he's approached his work, and he means so much to me. I just am very, very honored to honor this remarkable and very rare person who remains always in my heart and a big part of my life. And also, he didn't really abandon me because he left me with Rich Heller from the law firm, and he introduced me to Bart Walker, who has continued to be an angel of cinema for me, without whom, I don't know, I wouldn't even be here. So he really looked after me with these wonderful people. But Tom Rothman, it's a great honor to honor you. So.
Jim, I think the honor is mine, to be usual. Tom, we started out here, but we're not as pure as this guy anymore. We still like to think really dangerously, but you know. But here's the thing. I first met Tom in 1993 in the Golden Company. He outbid Harvey Weinstein to buy my second movie, little movie, Wedding Banquet. It's very impressive. When I first met him, I was a little scared of him, just the way he talked. It's like I was hard of hearing, or I don't speak English or something. But then I found out that's just the way he talked to everybody at any time. And we started tuning into this pretty good relationship. Tom has taken such great care of the film and myself. And the next movie, Eat, Drink, Man, Woman. So it's only logical. I followed him to Searchlight, the company he started at Fox with the Ice Storm. I can clearly remember the. Thank you. I can clearly remember the day I went in to talk to him about the film. I would always remember his advice to the film. He read the book, was very supportive of the project, except for one thing. He said, "That was just great, but can we not fry the fucking kids at the end?" The wonderful thing about Tom is that even when he said it, you know what he really meant. If you fry the fucking kid at the end of the movie, don't say I didn't warn you, but don't worry either. I'll be there for you, right, Tom? So we fried the kid. Because we're given a great gift of Tom's faith, his loyalty, and most of all, his love of movies, of all movies, big or small. Tom is a larger-than-life character. He's a one-of-a-kind movie mogul. Something very rare these days, I think. Head of a studio who actually, truly loves movies. His accomplishments speak for itself. You'll see it later. I'm just glad I can be part of his early story of his career. And finally, I caught up with you as you talked me into doing Life of Pi. I think I'm living proof that you still live dangerously. You still as movie mad as adventurous as you always was. And tonight, I'm just very glad I get a chance to present this award to you in a city where you got your start, and a city I believe still claims you its own. Thank you, Tom, for what you've done for this community, for the world cinema. Thank you.
Exactly what you are.
Now is the winter of our discontent.
Yeah, what the fuck you know about kids now?
We happy few. For he today that sheds his blood in me shall be my brother.
And all down there looks cheap. While Jenny speaks, the thought with us. A man said has been dead.
I'm an actor, and I have AIDS.
My name I cannot hide. Why? I have given you my soul. Leave me my name.
I know you're as anxious as I am to get into close action. England is under threat of invasion, and we will be on the far side of the world to test our nerve and discipline. Their greed will be their downfall. Oh, hell no. So to every hand whose rifle gun, puts the word and sharps the action.
Alright, everyone, gird your loins. Going for the full multi. Ready? Ready?
There's my eyes. Do you believe in love? The whole thing's I believe in love.
All you need is 20 seconds of insane courage. And I promise you, something great will happen. This is not forever, right? You'll be back. Once a star, always a threat.
So now if we have, they're going to cut it now, but because we have you here, so we don't need that anymore. But if we, they're going to cut it. Don't worry, just forget it's there. And welcome. It's like having you in 3D this way. It's like it's our own life of pi.
I've been making films for
We do have a projection.
30 years.
Oh, it may seem hard to believe at this moment.
And I've actually been doing that at Fox for 17 years now.
There we go. Okay, Mazel tov. So I am glad that we saw that, though, because Ang talks up there about your love of movies, and I do think that you know, I mean, when we started talking about doing this talk, I said, you know, in my previous life as the film critic at the LA Weekly, you were really the only studio executive that I had any kind of relationship with, because you were the only one who seemed interested in critics, or, you know, to really care about movies in that way, where the things beyond just the box office matter. And it seems like maybe a good place to start is to talk about your love of movies and where that originally comes from.
I was a movie lover growing up, and so I'm a guy, very, you know, rarely fortunate fellow who, you know, my father told me when I was very young, my dad worked a job, he worked hard, but he didn't really love his job, right? And he always subscribed to that thing that if your avocation and your vocation are the same thing, you'll never really work, right? And to do something you loved. And so that's been the real fortunate thing in my life. I always loved movies growing up. I was a movie buff, but I grew up in a household that was very oriented towards the arts. And I have an older brother who's an actor. I married an actress. My daughter works in the theater now. My father, as his real passion in life was the theater, and he started the local repertory theater in Baltimore, where I grew up, Center Stage. And so I grew up in a house where that was the commerce and the conversation at the table, and it didn't seem undoable. You know, I thought movies were fun when our age, growing up. Movies were the cutting edge, you know, art form, and the more you knew about movies, the more likely you were to get laid in college. And that's a technical, you know, that's a very technical term, and, you know, one of the very studious reasons for it. But, you know, that's what the French New Wave was for, after all. At least it's the only purpose for it I can figure out. I kind of, I got into the business because I loved movies, not because I loved the business or wanted the so-called quote-unquote glamour of it. None of that ever interested me. I liked films. It just seemed so great to be able to make that also be your work in life.
And talk a little bit about how you first came to work for the Samuel Goldwyn Company, and what the sort of landscape of American independent film was at the time, because now it feels almost like American independent film, it's become a little bit of a euphemism, and it's applied to a lot of films that are actually produced by studios and aren't very independent of mind or financing.
Yes, well, when I first, mine was a somewhat odd course. You saw in that clip, Jim Jarmusch, when I began my career in New York in the early 80s, was the really first wave, I would say. I would call it the post-Cassavetes. It was the new wave of American independent film. It came mostly out of New York, and it coincided with the beginnings of the so-called ancillary business, the beginnings of the video business and the beginnings of the international foreign sales business. And there were a lot of very talented young people, many of them coming out of NYU, you know, I was a young guy. They couldn't afford to pay anybody, and I wasn't anybody who could have begin to afford to charge anybody anything. So we all just worked with each other, I sort of helped pioneer the independent, and in those days it was truly independent because it was territory by territory financing in advance to get those films made. And I worked with Jim, and I worked with the late Bill Sherwood, and I worked with the great photographer Robert Frank, and I worked with Spike Lee, etc. And then, as Jim actually does tell in that story, I went to Columbia for a couple of years. That was my introduction to Hollywood. Yeah. And then after a couple of years there, I went to work for Sam Goldwyn, but this was, as you point out, at a very different time in the world. And there's a sort of a dividing line, a BC and an AD, but in the case of the independent film, it's really before Disney bought Miramax and after Disney bought Miramax. And at the days that you see a lot of those films that you've seen up there, Ang's Film, Wedding Banquet, and a number of films I did. I worked on the first films by Anthony Minghella, Truly, Madly, Deeply, and Ken Brown and Henry V, and
To Sleep with Anger,
To Sleep with
so
Anger,
many great
Charles
movies.
Burnett, and you saw David Lynch's film on there, Wild at Heart, and many real, what you would say today were indie landmarks. That was in the day when all of those companies were absolutely independent. They were not owned by any other companies, and they had no benefactors in the major studios. They were truly separate. They were separate aesthetically, and they were separate economically, too. And it was an even playing field, and the entire playing field was hand to mouth. It was desperate, and it was desperate, and it was dangerous, and it was barely, you barely survived. And all of those companies, Goldwyn was one of the premier ones, but Miramax before the sale, Cinecom, Avenue,
Island, Alive.
correct. There were many of those companies, and we were all fought it out, humping up and down the Quasetic can and trying to make a living. And it all depended on the ultimate ability of each individual film to get out. Well, then at a certain point in the early 90s, Disney bought Miramax, and that changed everything because it gave Miramax access to all of Disney's ancillary deals and all of their foreign deals and all of their home video operation. And in that moment, the playing field was not level anymore. It had changed. And in that moment, I sort of knew that the Goldwyn companies of the world, the landscape was going to be very difficult for them going forward. And in the next couple of years, I sort of came up with the idea, doing it different than Disney had done with Miramax, which was to actually start what became Fox Searchlight, which was an independent aesthetic within a major operation. So I guess they're now called dependents or whatever. They have taken over to a very large degree. That idea that I had some now 18 years ago has really become the standard. And Searchlight was the first, is probably the most enduring, but eventually Sony Classics came under the patronage of Sony, Focus comes under Universal, etc. And others have come and gone along the way because they don't know how to do it and they're not in it for the long haul and they don't understand the business. You have to still bring an independent mentality, sensibility, and economic structure to what you're doing. And if you didn't have the independent background, you don't really know how to do that. But if you do, boy, there's some, you saw them on that reel, it's still possible to make tremendously challenging, fascinating pictures. I mean, if you look at the pictures coming just from this year from the 20th Century Fox overall operation, which would include all of the Fox divisions, you will have, pictures as aesthetically varied and economically varied as Beasts of the Southern Wild on one hand and Life of Pi on the other. And that was the design. That's what I had in mind. Yeah, exactly. So,
And
that's a
animals.
long-winded answer.
Well, I'm thinking of a lot of things. I mean, one is that that brief time when you were at Columbia is sort of a storied moment in their history, and Putnam, to an extent, was trying to do a kind of indie aesthetic at the studio level, making a lot of very, ambitious, artistically daring films like The Last Emperor and Hope and Glory, and then a lot that didn't work that nobody even remembers anymore, like Zelly and Me and Stars and Bars and these kind of things. But in a way, how do you attribute sort of your incredible success and longevity at Fox and Fox Searchlight in being able to do these outside-the-box kind of films at the studio level and succeeding where maybe that model at Columbia didn't work in the 80s?
Well, David, who I admire tremendously, and is responsible, one of the key figures in, my life in film, I wouldn't have had the opportunity I had without him. But I always knew in my job at Fox that my job was to program for all audiences, right? And that just as you can, Beasts of the Southern Wild is fantastic, right? But that's a movie that'll do $10 to $20 million at the box office. Alvin and the Chipmunks, okay, over the three so far in the series, you're talking about almost $1 billion worldwide, okay? We just made a movie, I just saw today, our film Ice Age, the most recent Ice Age movie in the Ice Age series, which just had its last international market, so it opened in Italy this weekend, and that film is now the highest grossing animated film in the history of the international box office. That's the #1 international grossing film in history. Okay, so that's a movie that'll do, by the time it's done, close to $900 million, right? 850 to 900 million. So I never had any illusions. I wouldn't have been there for 18 years if all I made was, Boys Don't Cry.
Yeah.
You have to make Boys Don't Cry, which I love and adore, and then you have to make X-Men and Fantastic Four and Ice Age and Alvin. You have to program for all audiences. David wasn't interested in that, really. David was interested in his own sensibility, and I think that's slightly maybe the difference of coming from a pure producer background, where all those years as a producer, you would grab onto things that really interested you and just fight to the death for them, and that's how you did it. I think it was different to shift. For me, because I had worked my way up through various companies and seen the need over all those years to program a slate of movies, I always understood that, and I knew that my job was not to impose my own aesthetics. Every once in a while I got to do something that I really personally deeply loved, but my job was to try to understand the audience, try to program in a way that would effectively satisfy all various components of the audience in a way that was both, you always used to say the same thing. We tried to be fiscally prudent so that we could be creatively reckless.
Well, but that to me really puts you in line with, some of the sort of great moguls of Hollywood history, whether we're talking about, Irving Thalberg or, Darryl Zanuck at your own shop. Just, in the sense that they were interested in programming for all audiences. And if you think about, I mentioned you were showing a couple of Fox pictures tonight, Night in the City, the original Night in the City, and Whirlpool by Otto Preminger. And, these were films that weren't even taken seriously as artistic objects at the time. They are now. And I'm kind of intrigued with Fox, with the films, you mentioned Boys Don't Cry, Beasts of the Southern Wild. They're, relatively lower grossing films, but they're also lower risk films. You're in them for less. I'm kind of intrigued by some of the films we saw in the clip reel, like the Baz Luhrmann films, like Master and Commander, like Kingdom of Heaven by Ridley Scott, and like this year's opening night film Life of Pi, that are movies that don't really fit into any sort of model, and no defined genre or no precedent really that you guys have made big investments in, and that in many cases have paid handsome rewards. And how difficult is it to sort of get a movie like that off the ground?
First of all, I have to thank you but stop you. I don't want to, for a moment, let it go. It's very kind of you to put me in the same sentence with Daryl Zanuck and Irving Thalberg, but there really isn't anyone in our world, although it is true to say that in the 75-year history of Fox, I was the longest running guy there and responsible for the movies except for Daryl Zanuck. But those guys were very different, because it was the studio system, right? And everybody worked for them. So it was entirely different. The end ultimate product was the same, but the process entirely different than the process in the modern business after the studio system has eroded. You're right, interestingly, I think, in your assessment of us, which is that studios, they have a certain DNA, right? And if you look, say, at the most obvious one, of course, being Disney, their DNA being their brand. But if you look at Warner Brothers, you'll see a DNA, a big star for years and years, big star-driven, vehicle. Fox's DNA is, in my time, was perhaps ironically and less obviously a certain eclecticism. We were never necessarily the big star studio, but we were very ambitious, and we did take a lot of risk artistically. And it's what I said before, and sometimes financially. We made the two biggest movies of all time, okay? Titanic and Avatar. Both of those films, at the time we made them, while we were making them, and in the run-up to releasing them, were extreme gambles. They were extreme gambles. Now, we had done prudent things. We tried to get partners. We tried to protect ourselves to the degree that we could. But those are big gambles, right? Well, with great risk comes great reward, okay? Those are the two biggest films in the history of the movie business by about, Avatar is probably $1 billion higher than the next biggest film, which is Titanic, and it's probably $1.5 billion bigger than a non-Fox film. And because there was Avatar, unlike Titanic, there will be Avatar 2 and there will be Avatar 3, right? So the ultimate reward to the company is, that endows the company with economic resources that literally last for decades, okay? Now, you can also take risks that fail, but you cannot take risk out of the movie business. And if you try to do that, and studios have tried to do it along the way, eventually the product becomes so routine and so dull that the audience will turn away. What's hard today is to balance the need, ultimately, I believe strongly and passionately, for originality, right, with the difficulty of marketing originality. Because it's much easier to sell a known quantity. It's much easier to sell X-Men. It's much easier to sell Batman. It's much easier to sell something based on a known property. And the marketing world out there is really tough. For films. All of those things are easier to sell than A Life of Pi, right? But ultimately, if you don't risk ambition, if you don't pursue originality, okay, then I believe, although you have to try to do it as prudently as you can, but if you don't, I think two things. I think one, you're eventually going to lose because routinity isn't going to work anymore. It's not going to get people to the theater. It's not going to drive long-term value, number one. And number two, not to put too fine a point on it, but then what the fuck are you doing in the job? I mean, how many sequels can you make? So a lot, and you need them, and they're good to have. But I will say this: you have to be very careful with your recklessness, okay? And there is no way. We had Life of Pi for 10 years. 10 years, okay? We loved it. We believed in it. We tried, and we tried for 10 years. But there's no way Life of Pi gets, well, I was there anyway, gets made without Ang Lee, okay? So that it's what that risk is, that's a bet, and that's not a movie. That movie could not have been made for a Searchlight budget. If it could have been, it would have been made 10 years ago. It would have been easy. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about it, but it couldn't have been done. It simply wasn't possible, okay? So the bet on that case is twofold. It's a bet on ambition, an ambition of ideas, an ambition of originality, an ambition of spirituality, all of those things. And it's a bet on a filmmaker, ultimately, on a man who, you know, I've been fortunate enough, I've made 4 movies with him. This is the 4th one. I think he's one of the great living filmmakers, and I think he was a perfect match for the material. That's the other thing. I thought it was a perfect match. So that if you were going to take a chance, and it's still a chance, went great here Friday night, and, you know, we love it, but the box office has yet to speak, you know. If you were going to take a chance, you better take a chance with a real, on talent. And a lot of the ones that you referred to, certainly that's the case with Jim Cameron. There was no greater talent. A lot of those movies that you mentioned, Baz Luhrmann, the Moulin Rouge, all those movies, it's when you've hit it right with the pairing of the talent and the material. And that is, interestingly, probably that's probably the most important aspect of my job over those 18 years. And in that regard, guys who have and women who have my job today, and there are many women, fortunately, who haven't, and there were none back in the day. That's the same. That was the same central thing that, you know, the great moguls, the Thalbergs and the Zaneks had to do. Now they owned that talent, and that talent worked for them, right? And they had constraints on that talent, but they still had to make the right choices.
This may seem like a slightly off-the-wall question, but I think it's something people wonder who don't work in the studio world is, what is an average day like for a studio head? I mean, what happens when you drive onto the lot in the morning until you drive off at night? What are you usually consumed with?
Meetings. You have meetings. I probably have
like the rest of us.
Like the rest of us. Meetings and emails. It's not particularly glamorous or exotic, and beautiful starlets are not coming in to have discussions. It's meetings and emails and a lot of grinding through it. So, the day is typical. What's great about it is that comes back to the very first thing you said, that if you happen to be like I was, a guy who really loves movies, you're lucky, because that's what your meetings are about, right? You don't have to talk about how many cartons of Coca-Cola you're shipping to Venezuela. You get to talk about what issues are on the most recent films that you're working on, or films you're aspiring to do, or what the problems are. On the other hand, when you're the head of the company, a lot of it is administrative and human resources, and you don't spend your whole time tap dancing on the table. It's although I was in a meeting when the original Spice Girls came in before they were the Spice Girls, and they did dance on the table. That was the only dancing on the table, though, I ever witnessed.
I want to ask you, since it has to do sort of with the world I come from and that I still dabble in from time to time, what you think about reporting about the industry, and whether people are fair or not when they talk about the studios and the general sort of picture that gets painted of the studios, which to my mind is one that says it's only about the bottom line, and the studios only are producing sequels and remakes and this and that and the other thing. And I mean, I think we've kind of already proved tonight that that's not the case, but it does seem to drive the conversation to a certain extent.
Look, maybe now in my new state in life, I say more about it. You can't really ever, you get nowhere. It doesn't profit to complain about the press because it comes with the territory, right? That's the nature of the beast. It's a public. Ours is a fairly public. We're in the media spotlight. We live on the media spotlight, so it's like get used to it. It's like a politician trying to complain about his press. But I will say this about it: I don't think it's accurate, right? And I think it repeats received wisdom over and over and over again. It's like saying, oh, okay, the Democrats are soft on defense. Yeah, but so what the hell's Obama doing in Afghanistan? And the Republicans are for small government. Yeah, well, how come Bush expanded the government to a greater degree than any president in the history of the world, created more agencies? Well, no, that's just received wisdom, right? Okay, studio executives are Philistines, and they're only interested in, making a buck, and then. Well, our job, we have shareholders, is to make a buck. It's not my experience at all. Not about myself. It's kind. People often say to me that, oh, you love movies. I do love movies. I'm a little more, as Ang did a wonderful imitation of me, so I'm a little more of a demonstrative personality. But my experience of, that was an understated way of saying it, but what the hell, it's like, get up in the morning, you should be excited to be alive. It's fun. But my experience is that I'm not alone in that, okay? And that there are really terrific, and I know most of them over the years, but if Amy Pascal were sitting here, or Stacey Snider, or Elizabeth Gabler, or Emma Watts, or any number of people, I mean, these are tremendously smart film minds, right? They love movies, they love talent, they're dedicated, they've dedicated their whole life to it. And I will say this about the press, you think it's so fucking easy, you should try it once in a while, Okay, go ahead. I'm sure you could have done better for 18 years, but, I'm just fucking humping it up the hill every day, doing the best I can. So, because let me tell you, here's another thing that I can tell you. I can tell you absolutely 100%, 100% I can tell you what movies are hits and what are failures on the Monday after they open. So, 100%. So, and so can the press. So, maybe, in advance, it's a little harder, and I batted about 750 to 800, which is probably, about as high as you can get. So, I think what it is there's this, the phrase I used is received wisdom. A less nice phrase is there's just a cliched understanding of it, and it's a cliched character. It's like, I don't believe. I mean, yes, there are craven politicians, no doubt about it, right? And there are, I'm sure, crooked lawyers and. But are all politicians craven? Are all lawyers crooked? I don't think so, right? Are all studio executives Philistines? I don't think so. Not in my experience of it, I think many of them are really hardworking. It's a hardworking job, They really commit to it. They really back talent all the time, and they have to stand up for it. And I could tell you dozens of really smart, terrific, worldly people, and that's in my own company and among over the years, and there were the opposition. So, but I don't think the flip is also true. I don't think it will change, because I think, from what makes Sammy run to The Last Tycoon to The Player to the whatever. It's deeply ingrained in the popular mindset and the popular culture. So, but I never minded it. I'll tell you, because it was that's a fib. I minded. Everybody minds it. You have to be made of something else not to mind it. But let me put it this way: the trade-off for getting to do it was well worth it.
We have time for a couple of questions from out here in the audience. So, we have a microphone coming around.
Hi. Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just hold it
I
close.
wanted to know your thoughts on Life of Pi as a 3D spectacle, how this might change public perception of 3D. I know a while ago Scorsese and Mr. Lee talked about a way that audiences might take 3D more seriously, or their perception of 3D may change with this particular film.
Well, thank you. It's a very good question, and the answer I would say is I hope so. This is what I think is different about it, and even different than Hugo, actually, as wonderful and beautifully done as that was. And having sort of been at the forefront of it, because I was there with Jim Cameron when the breakthroughs were made for Avatar, right? And I know that his ambition for that was always actually what it is that Ang, interestingly, is driving at, which is that 3D be part not just of the visual spectacle of the experience, but of the emotional experience. And Ang's interest, we had never conceived of Pi as being a 3D movie. We didn't think of it that way when we were developing it. And we've been working on it for a while, right? And also, it's very hard technically to make that particular movie in 3D. That took a whole, generational advancement of technology to be able to do that. But Ang's reason for it was emotional. It wasn't visual, right? It was to try to enhance the audience connection with that character's emotional journey. And that's the way, when you see the film, you'll see that the 3D is used, okay? And that's the way he thought about it. So I think if we're lucky enough that the film succeeds and that the wonderful reaction that the audience had here on Friday night is indicative of the reaction that audiences will have around the world, I think they may open a new willingness and a new understanding about 3D, that it's not just, there's Life of Pi obviously has great visual spectacle to it, but that the virtues of 3D can relate to the emotionality of the storytelling too. And ultimately, there's no doubt my fundamental belief of all movies, if you pare it down, is that no matter how fabulous looking a film is, it's ultimately how the movie makes the audience feel that determines its place in history. And Ang's genius in this was always using the 3D to enhance how Pi felt and how the audience feels being with him on that journey.
Oh, sorry. Well, I guess somewhat simple question. What are a few or several of your favorite films of all time?
Well, I've been asked that question before, so I sort of have the answer at the ready, I guess. It depends. The film that was most instrumental in my life was Lawrence of Arabia, which I saw as a young boy and just blew my mind. I never forgot it, and it just changed everything for me. And it also became very somehow important because when I was at Columbia, I happened to be fortunate enough to be there when it was being restored. And I am one of my most treasured Hollywood memories is that I sat in the Goldwyn Theater at the Academy with David Lean, who was in ill health but had flown over from Africa 3 seats away from him, and watched him watch the restored version of Lawrence of Arabia. And I thought somehow there was some level of destiny in that. But, so I'd say that's that's sort of the seminal film for me. I also mentioned to people there's a film called, from an early phantasmagoric film from Brian De Palma called Phantom of the Paradise, because I met my wife through that movie. So, and through my wife, I had my children. So I would say that that movie ranks right up there. And then there are others. Rebecca, To Be or Not to Be, the Lubitsch version is probably my favorite comedy. So those are the films. At Fox, I never answer that question because I love all my children, right? Obviously, we made some of the biggest movies of all time. There are movies like Master and Commander that I myself worked on for more than a dozen years to get made. But I'll tell you, I genuinely, even the ones that didn't work out so well, it was always the experience. There was always someone wonderful to meet. It's like a thing where my wife, there's this thing where you get crew jackets. They make these crew jackets or sweaters or whatever like this. And after all these years, and, I've supervised over more than 500 films, right? I got a lot of crew jackets. Right? And, I would give a lot to, homeless shelters and things like that. But my wife keeps trying to throw a lot of them away, right? And she'll put her hand on a jacket and say, "You're never going to wear this jacket." I said, "Yeah. That movie lost $40 million, okay? That's the most expensive jacket you'll ever see. Don't touch it." Right? I want to remember that jacket, okay? So there's always something, there's always something in them. I will say this, and I don't think it's just, primacy and recency. A lot of the films that were on there, at each moment in my career, there was always a film that somehow happened. I did work on Last Emperor with David Putnam, the first film that I worked on that won the Academy Award, right? Then when I went to the Goldwyn Company, the first film that I really did there was Henry V with Ken Branagh, when that seemed to be impossible to do Shakespeare. When I went to start Searchlight, the first film there was The Brothers McMullen, that really came out of nowhere and worked and put the company on the map, right? And then when I moved to so-called Big Fox, there was Titanic. And then when I took over the movie maker operations at Hells, we made the first X-Men movie, right? And now, this Friday, Life of Pi is a film that I look at with really immeasurable pride. There's a confluence of many events that have come together for that film, and its story is yet to be written. But it's certainly a film that, at the very least, is atypical to come from a studio. The level of ambition, the level of risk, the level of originality, those are not things that are common, right? And I'm deeply proud of it.
I think we one more here. Yeah.
I'm just very in awe of your ability to predict and your instinct for what will work and what will succeed at the box office. I know you spoke about originality. Is there any other factors that you kind of look for that you think will resonate with people, like the indomitable human spirit, or what do you look for in a story?
Well, first of all, you said that it's very kind of you. Of course, that's because we're not talking about all my bombs, right? So, and
that's a subsequent discussion.
That's a subsequent discussion, and they just kicked me out after all these years. So, it's not. I'm far from perfect, believe me. But there are certain things, and what I call them, so to speak, they're movie universals. There are universals, and you look for the universal in the specific. But yes, there are those things, and ultimately, it comes to what I said before. What is emotionally moving about it, right? Even comedy, the best comedy, the biggest, craziest, wildest comedy I ever did, there's Something About Mary. When you look at that comedy, right, as explosively funny as it was at the time, that's full of great heart, and it makes you feel warm and good, right? Tragedy, yes, you have tragedy, but is there heroism in the tragedy? One of the best movies I think I ever worked on is a film that didn't do particularly well at the box office, but I think it's fabulous, called The Crucible, which is a pure tragedy, but it's a tragedy with heroism in it, right? So there are movie universals, and because it's an interactive art form. That's a fascinating thing about it. It doesn't exist by itself. It exists in relation to the audience and how the audience feels about it and how the audience reacts to it. So, those are the kinds of things that you look for. Then over years, you get experience, just practical experience in the marketplace. You learn to know what's very difficult to sell. You learn to know what genres are harder and easier than others. But that's more workmanlike, and that just comes from experience. After a number of years, you develop a lot of experience, and it's like the buyer at Macy's knows what shoes are going to sell this fall. So
we're just about out of time, but I just want to say, for people who don't know, it was recently announced that you're going to be producing Steven Spielberg's new film, Robo-Apocalypse. You told me in an email that a week of retirement was enough for you. Are you excited about coming full circle in a way and returning to the world of hands-on producing after this sort of quarter-century sojourn through the executive channels?
Yeah, I am very excited about it. I'm looking forward to it greatly. But again, you keep it in context. Steven Spielberg, one of the greatest filmmakers alive, has done very, very well without needing me. So I don't inflate my own, import there. I was very flattered and grateful that he should ask me. And I did announce my resignation and realized that about a week of contemplated retirement was going to be plenty for me. And I was ready to go to work. So I do look forward to it. That's an interesting thing. It's a long way from, Parting Glances to that film, in that's big. That's big picture making, right? That's the kind of thing that I've gained a lot of experience with over the last few years in the working through the Avatars and the Planet of the Apes and the X-Men's and the, basically uber-size filmmaking that are very effect-driven, that are international. That's a film that, will make primarily in London, but it'll, really it's a very, very global in scope, and that kind of, that's a lot of, in honesty, what I've learned in the last few years in my job. So I like to keep growing and keep learning, and so that's an opportunity. It's also, I'll just tell you, going back, I guess, to your first question, excuse me, I cussed a lot, didn't I? I'm sorry. But it's just us and there's 6 people there, whatever. Oh, well, they do that sort of thing. But are you fucking kidding me? I'm just some punk from Baltimore, and I'm going to get to stand there and watch Steven Spielberg? Steven Spielberg, make the kind of movie, epic science fiction movie that he's the greatest alive at. It's like come on, Dad, I did what you said, you know. I got a job I loved. So I consider myself incredibly fortunate and honored.
Well, we're very honored to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
Tom Rothman, Macy's shoe buyer extraordinaire. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Scott. I enjoyed it.
Sit tight. We'll be back in just a few moments with a selection of New York Film Festival filmmakers.